welcome. My name is Igor Marjanovic, and together with Jen Howard, I'm the co-curator of the exhibition called Drawing Ambience, Alvin Boyarsky and the Architectural Association that opened last Friday at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. So it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you all tonight for this lecture and to introduce our speaker tonight, Dennis Crompton. The exhibition, Drawing Ambience, is co-organized by our own Kemper Art Museum and the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island, and it will travel to Providence after St. Louis, opening at RISD on April 23rd. So everyone here is also invited to the RISD premiere of the exhibition as well. The lecture tonight by Dennis Crompton, as I said, is in support of the exhibition called Drawing Ambience. And before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum who supported this amazing exhibition and also for supporting architecture at Washington University in St. Louis and also for sponsoring the lecture tonight as well. The title of the exhibition, Drawing Ambience, is has an interesting twofold meaning. It refers to the content of the drawings themselves, which are very imaginative. Each drawing has a particular spatial or atmospheric quality that could be called an ambience, but the phrase drawing ambience also refers to a particular spatial ambience of the Architectural Association, where Alvin Boyarsky was a long-standing chairman between 1971 and 1990, where these drawings were displayed, discussed, and further elaborated through catalogs. So the idea behind the exhibition is to introduce this set of drawings both as individual artworks, as individual pieces, but also in dialogue with each other through a particular form of spatial ambience. In support of that particular concept, we also installed a few pieces of furniture in the center room of the exhibition. Now that the opening festivities are over, we thought that as a way to sort of engage the content of the exhibition and to sort of translate some of that special spatial ambience of the AA, the audience would enjoy sitting in a furniture that echoes some of the English clubs of the period, of which AA was one of the examples, and also look at drawings up close and also listen to some of the amazing audiovisual material that supports the exhibition. In particular, the ambience room allows you to hear Alvin Boyarsky's own voice. He actually has a lecture there that we sort of prepared on one of the iPads that actually Dennis Crompton has worked very hard to put together, where he speaks about the history of the School of Architecture at the AA, but also the history of 19th and 20th century architecture through drawings. Basically, the lecture itself is an extended system of captions where he covers the history and the evolution of architecture and changes that have occurred in the last 100 and 150 years by looking at the drawings and trying to understand those changes through drawings. So I hope you all get a chance to revisit the show and enjoy some of that material as well. It is my great pleasure, as I said, to introduce Dennis Crompton as our speaker tonight. Dennis Crompton is one of the founding members of the Archigram group, which was active between 1961 and 1975, a group that maybe doesn't need a very specific introduction, because in many ways the group was very present in many media outlets, newspapers, magazines, film, video, because the body of work that they produced over that decade or so was very diverse. They've spanned different types of architectural production, ranging from architectural projects to drawings, collages, film, even opera, and many other forms of production that I'm sure in some way many of you are familiar with. Dennis is also a great friend of the school. He's taught here before as a visiting professor and has collaborated also on a project with one of our colleagues, Heather Wooster, called Metabolic City, that had a very important exhibition here in the Kemper Museum as well. Dennis is a very Renaissance man in many ways. He wears many hats, and one of the hats is the Archigram hat, which is a very important one. But in addition to that, he also has in his closet many other hats that he puts on occasionally. And one of those is that he's very involved with the Lantern Society in London. So he has his own collection of magic lanterns. and he's worked on a book that documented the history of projections through the history of the magic lantern. In addition to that, and that's something that he will touch upon tonight as well, he was the main dynamo behind a series of publications published at the Architectural Association under Alvin Boyarsky that were put under the umbrella of the AA publications. At the school, he headed the communications unit, which developed very inventive ways for extending the lives of the drawings beyond the exhibition into the catalog. And each catalog had a very unique format, and many of them you can actually enjoy on view at the gallery. So for tonight's lecture, he'll put a hat of the director and the head of the communications unit at the AA and the publisher, and he can tell us more about the unique ways in which the drawings reached a new life in the way that they were reproduced in the catalog. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Dennis Crompton to the podium.
I'll sit here if you don't mind. Everybody else is sitting down, perhaps while I should. Right. Igor, as usual, most people introducing me exaggerate, but I'm too modest to contradict exaggerations. That's gracefully what you talk about. What I want to do first is that there are two things. We've got to turn the lights out somehow or other. I'd like to make a couple of things not particularly clear, but just explain a couple of things. All the exciting things that I'm going to mention tonight are actually across the way in the exhibition. But the describing and taking credit for the exciting things was not my role at the AA. I was more the sort of engine driver. I think Igor just used the term dynamo. I was the mechanic, who ran the engine room. My function, actually both with the AA publications and with Archigram for that matter, is largely that of making things happen. Partly I got into that because I had that sort of architectural education. When I first studied architecture, I had a choice between two universities, one of which was very well known for its aesthetic qualities. It's the place where Jim Sterling had studied, where Colin Rowe had been teaching, and so on. And another university in the adjoining town, which was best known for its technological education. And I chose the technological education, which somewhat surprised the professor in charge of the more well-renowned university. But anyway, I was interested in how he made things work. So that's my sort of background. Now, the other thing I want to talk about first is the Architectural Association itself, the School of Architecture. It's totally different in almost every way from the Sandbox School, and for that matter from most other schools, or every other school. We can start off with any luck. Well, that's not quite starting off, but if I can hit the right button somewhere here. Alvin.
The Architectural Association School of Architecture has its roots in the 19th century. It was a time when the professions were not particularly organized for education, and there's no way in which a young person working for an established architect could take an exam and become a professional architect in his own right. And young architectural draftsmen in London began to meet to talk about the possibility of founding a course. They invited people from the profession who they thought might be sympathetic to them. And there were meetings in pubs and in people's living rooms, and eventually some more formal evening meetings. And out of this developed a pressure group, which eventually established the first English-speaking school of architecture in the world, and which incidentally had succeeded in proposing a bill in Parliament to force an examination for architects to be qualified. And in this way, the Royal Institute of British Architects became involved in a formal educational system. So that the beginnings of the Architecture Association School of Architecture have established a tradition which the school, to this day, is nourished by.
So it was actually 1845. So the school itself is nearly 180 years old. And as Alvin was just explaining it, it wasn't ever part of an institution, it wasn't part of a university, it wasn't part of the Royal Institute of British Architects. It was set up and organised, and still is organised, by a combination of the people who teach in the school, the students in the school, and the graduates of the school, which make up the association itself. A part of its constitution from the beginning has been an obligation to publish about architecture, about research, about work being done in the school. So what was done in the 1970s, 1980s by Alvin Boyarsky continued a tradition that had started many years ago. These, as you can see, these are some covers of publications 1867, that's quite a while ago. And what the result is 1874. So that's the sort of standard that had already been established 100 years before Alvin came along and started to continue this tradition. So it wasn't new what he was doing. It had certainly declined in the middle of the 20th century, between the Second World War and 38-45 and 1971 when Alvin became chairman. Partly for technical reasons, partly for financial reasons, and partly perhaps from lack of enthusiasm. But there were still publications going on. I started teaching there in 1964, and I still have a few pamphlets, publications, and so on that were produced in the school during that period between 64 and 72, 74, when we started seriously producing publications. At the beginning of the 1970s, Alvin was elected chairman of the school in 1971-72, and at that time we always had exhibitions, but they tended to be put together by other institutions, and they'd arrive in a few packing crates, and we'd unpack them. We'd make a banner or something like this banner here. Oops. Sorry about that. I'll try and keep still. And they'd arrive and come out of packing crates, and they just got, hung around the room in this sort of way. But it was a start. What happened to really sort of kick-start the whole operation was in 1974, for some reason, slide doesn't want to advance. Excuse me. There we go. There was two of the tutors in the school had been working in their professional lives as historians and researchers. They've been working in Libya, and I'll stop moving my head so quickly. Sorry about that. I'm trying to stay still. They've been working in research in Libya, architectural and archaeological research. And the subject of the research was Islamic art and architecture in Libya. And the Libyan government, when their research was well advanced, thought it'd be a good idea to have an exhibition in London. And as they were teaching in the AA, the obvious place to house this exhibition was the Architectural Association Galleries. So this was kicked off, and this was the kick-off of the series of publications that occurred over the next 16 years. Over that next 16 years, and I'll show you some more detail in a minute, we produced 86 publications, which is, I think, fairly remarkable for any. So this was the Libyan, which was a very straight up and down thing. This was poster actually produced in the Archigram office, but don't tell anybody about that. And it was very simple, like the exhibition I'd shown you before about the architecture of the German Republic. Just a series of boards, photographs and text mounted on them and displayed around the school. But we did produce a catalogue. And this, as I say, this is actually 1976 when this was produced. Now, what you've got to also be aware of, which I'm sure most of you are not aware of, is that 1976 was still in the sort of pre-digital age. There was nothing at all digital. Everything was done by hand. That if you wanted text, you typed it, and if you had enough resources, you got it to be set in metal so that it reproduced properly, or if you had less resources, you typed it. As any of you have seen issues of Archigram, I mean, what we did with Archigram, you know, you type a bit of text and use some rubber cement and stick it down on the sheet together with the illustrations and all the rest of it, and letter set for captions or headings, and it was all very much a sort of handcraft operation. As I say, if you had the resources, you went to compositors, and the whole of printing was an industry that was impenetrable from outside. So you would get text set in metal like this, and you'd get galleys off it, and then maybe because litho printing, offset litho printing was now more generally available, you'd paste down the galleys and paste in photographs, and you'd finish up with some printable material. But round about the beginning, well, towards the end of the 1960s, and as far as we're concerned, in about 1973, IBM, who produced that in the 1960s, electric typewriters, which again were a great innovation, and an even bigger innovation was electric typewriters that weren't like the old standard typewriters with a carriage that sort of went backwards and forwards as you typed, and hammers that came and sort of went through an ink ribbon to make impressions on the paper. This was enclosed, and it had a golf ball which sort of went across, and the golf ball moved and was rotated in order to orientate it so you got the right characters. And they started making a composer which was aimed at the low end of the printing industry. And we acquired one of these around about 1973, and a lady who knew how to work it, which was rather important, because it wasn't just like a typewriter. Well, it was just like a typewriter, except it had this refinement, which are these two dials and buttons and whatnot to either side. And it was incredibly laborious, and the lady who worked it, not necessarily always too patient, but anyway, you had to type everything twice in order to get a line of typesetting. You had to, if you wanted it justified, that's flush up left and right, so the type fits across uniformly across the columns. And you typed the line first, and this machine counted the number of spaces between the words and gave you a clue how to set up this dial. Then you type the line again, and it put in the spaces in between the words in order to make the line work. Sorry, I'm labouring this a bit, but there's a reason for my madness. And you had these golf balls, which had it's a £2 piece, which is slightly larger than a dollar piece. So you had these golf balls, and each one of these had a different typeface on it. We had a set of golf balls. I think you could get small, medium, and large, and you could get sort of regular Roman, and you could get italic. And if you wanted to change anything at all, you had to stop, you had to change the golf ball. Of course, you couldn't then justify the line, and so it's Anyway, the Libyan catalogue was done using this machine, and you can see here the sort of problem you've got because of this changing the type head on the machine. If you look at the word soup somewhere in here, oh yes, that, you see how it's italic and the rest is Roman. And to do that, Dominic, the operator, had to stop the machine, change the golf ball, type SUK, change the golf ball back, type comma, get the space and the rest of it. And she had to do that for every line of the text. Then, of course, she finishes this paragraph and we look over it and say, oh, this Suits here wasn't in italic. You know, and then, so Dominic sort of, just before blowing steam out of her ears, says, well, that's not my fault, you have to do something about it. So we get her to retype Suits in italic, and then rather clumsily stick it into the bit of italic text. So this was how we were operating at the time. So that's a column of text. This is the sort of thing, sorry, I'm looking at this rather obliquely, but you can see how awful it was. If you look at that line, or those two lines, or even those four lines there, you can see how there's these great spaces in between the words. And this is how you got the lines to justify left and right. So that continued for 5 or 6 years. That was 1978. So between 1978 and 1962, we produced a whole pile of these small catalogues. They're 7.5 inches square. I think we produced 21 of them using that sort of system. And that was the entry point into producing publications in this phase of the Architectural Association's life under Alvin Boyarsky. Just a slight aside, that was the first, J.J. Feud was the first catalogue we did, and this was the second one, Daniel Liebskin, and then various other ones. So initially, again, there's a thing about binding, where you, basically, it's called staple stitching, but basically means you staple the pages together and you don't get any spine. So these early ones were just folded paper with staples in the spine. Later ones, like this, and the Kiesler and this one here, had a square spine, which again, it's a more elaborate way of binding a little booklet. We, fortunately, throughout this whole period of, from 72 or 73 when we started until, well after Alvin's death in 1990, we worked with the same group of printers and plate makers, which was great because we were all learning together, and obviously front together as well, that's something else. But we were all learning together because the whole industry was developing. It wasn't like now, you go to a printer and they've got big machines and they've got computers and everything. You put in one end, you put in the information, and something comes out the other end. No, this period we were all learning together, which was very exciting, and very often I talk to Alvin about a project, and he'd want something, this, that and the other, and I go to the printers and plate makers and say, what we're going to do is this, that and the other. And they said, Dennis, that's impossible. I said, no, we've got to learn how to do it. Nothing's impossible, and nothing was. So we did learn how to do it. Anyway, this is a bit dim, I don't know if you can see it, it's not that important anyway. But this is a graph of production from, 1976 at that end, and 1995 at that end. So you can see that this particular year, which is 1987, we produced 10 publications. Not the little publications like those catalogues I was showing you, but elaborate publications. Some little ones as well. And that's in a period, not in a period of 12 months, because the school only operates 32 weeks of the year. So that's within a period of 32 weeks. And that only includes the formal publications that we produce, like the ones that you see in the exhibition. Also, on top of that, there was the weekly events list that we produced. There was the pre-term publication of the prospectus for the school. There was the end-of-year projects review, which again you can see samples of both of those in the exhibition. So we were quite busy. At one stage in the print studio, I had 8 to 12 people working. So and we were in two teams because we were actually producing or publishing a catalogue or something every 4 weeks, because that was the frequency of the new exhibitions opening during that period. So it was very intense and very concentrated. One of the things about Alvin Boyarsky, which I'm sure you immediately can tell just by going into the exhibition, and the way, incidentally, that Igor here and Nicholas Boyarsky, Alvin's son, and Nicola Boyarsky, his partner and wife, have designed and put the thing together. I'm sure you can tell the perfection that Alvin sought from everything that happened, in publications and in the school altogether. And one of the things that, I don't know, maybe Igor and Nicholas weren't aware of it, but one of Alvin's slogans, which is very appropriate for the exhibition, was "We fight our battles with the drawings on the wall." Because architecture, remember, this is the 1970s, 1980s, period of postmodernism and so on. You will not see any postmodernism on the walls across the road, but you still see the argument about the nature of architecture by the drawings that were produced at the Architectural Association, by students, by staff members, by friends, and so on, chosen from the publications. And that was important. But anyway, back to the engine room. The IBM Selectric typewriter lasted about 4 or 5 years, very laboriously. That's why those small catalogues for the things that we produced in that time, because technically it was the only thing we could do. Then the Alvin and the AA invested something, and remember this is the 1970s, late 1970s, something like $50,000 in this machine, which is a compugraphic edit writer, 7500, which is the beginning of the entry into book production of the digital world. Now, it's not truly digital. What it is, it's a photo setter. That thing at the end there is like a big washing machine. And inside the lid, there's a large flywheel, about that sort of diameter. And you've had strips, film strips, with 4 different alphabets, not different typefaces, but different alphabets in the same typeface. So you get a regular Roman, you get the Italic version of the Roman, you get a bold version of the original typeface, and you get a bold Italic. And through the keyboard instructions that you could type in here, you could control this spinning flywheel. And the flywheel spun round, and then there was like a laser, a flash, xenon flash, where the right character appeared in the right place. And in the front part of there was a cassette with photosensitive paper. And this thing sort of, it did work, it sounded like a washing machine, a word away. And there was no WYSIWYG, you couldn't see what you're doing. Everything you wanted to do had to be done by encoding. It's very much like now, if you're designing a web page, this HTML and all the rest of it, any of you are familiar with that. But it's easy enough to see the result. We were doing the equivalent of HTML on this machine, but not being able to see the result until later when the bromide paper had been exposed and it came out, and then you discover any mistakes you've made. You were able to record it. We had 7.5-inch or 7-inch floppy disks this sort of size, that went in the machine as well. And the thing, if any of you are into typesetting, there's a thing called letter spacing and kerning. There was a little cassette that went in the front here that governed the spacing between the letters when it was being set. And it was pretty appalling, the spacing between the letters. And I, one afternoon, got so fed up with it that I phoned CompuGraphic, the American company, and had like a 2-hour conversation about the letter spacing of their typefaces, and in the end there was nothing I could do about it, basically. So, but anyway, that was that. By the way that the optics were arranged, you could have a whole series of type sizes, which was again, a big breakthrough from the IBM and its golf course. So you could go from very small up to very large, 72 point, if you know anything about it. It's a body height of 1 inch. It's not 1 inch, that's not the size of the character, it's the size of the piece of metal that the character would have been on when it was in the traditional metal setting. Anyway, that brought us into a whole other area of publications. And I'll come back to both of these later, but these were the first and the last in the themes series of publications. Themes, Alvin used publications as part of the educational program, partly to encourage units in the school to do serious work. As I said before, part of the constitution of the AA was that the school, or the Architectural Association rather than just the school, was obliged to publish its research and so on. And this was a carrot, if you like, for the teachers in the school. So that the school, again, I should explain more about the organisation of the school. The school wasn't organised in years, it was organised in units. And it was possible for a student to stay in the same unit for up to 3 years, or 4 years if it was a long period. So there was a first year which every student went into, and although they were units, there were those first year units. When they came out of first year into second year, they had a choice of something, depending on the year, between 20 and 28 different units. And each unit at the beginning of the year had to present its programme to the whole student body. Students would then nominate the unit that they wanted to join. But that didn't mean they joined it, because the student then was interviewed by the unit, and the unit staff could choose whether or not to take the student. So there was a lot of jostling around going on during the first 3 or 4 weeks of term. But once in a unit, if the student wanted, he could stay in, or she could stay in that unit for 3 or 4 years. They could also move if they wanted to, they weren't obliged to stay there. But what it meant was there could be continuous research into a particular series of topics. This as I said, we'll come back to architecture and continuity in a moment, and at the end, let's talk a little about this evolutionary architecture. But it meant that as a device for encouraging the unit to work in this progressive experimental way, that they carry out an investigation over a series of years, and after 4, 5, 6 years, when they felt they were ready to conclude the investigations and to publish what they were doing, then the school, with the unit, produced a publication such as this Architecture and Continuity. That was the unit run by Alvin Boyarsky, and this is John Fraser. So this is a spread from that catalogue, and I think I've got Alvin again somewhere. Alvin. Maybe it's
David Borvesley and his students, in this case Nigel Westbrook, a young Australian student, were very much involved in the issues to do with the reconstruction of the city. Their interest was essentially to reproduce the richness and variety and loving care that was to be found in some of the ancient cities and some of the medieval cities and so on, so that you would find places to be married, places for the aged, music schools, places for magicians to be educated, and so on and so forth, in an infill project. His work in the Kentish Town area has been commemorated in a catalogue called Architecture and Continuity, and the drawing of Nigel Westbrook's indicates the character of the architecture, its layering both in plan and section, and its references to everyday construction.
okay, Zaha Hadid. I guess all of you have heard of Zaha. Nobody had when I first met her, but she's quite loud, so everybody very soon has heard about Zaha. She joined the school as a third-year student in the early 70s and progressed through the school. progressed through the school. She, again, one of the things that any of you who went to the gallery tour from Sunday, Nicholas and Igor here, one of the things that they didn't explain was the genealogy that Zaha was a part of. But Ilis Engelis, who was part of the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Omar, he had a first-year student who he thought was very talented, and he guided through and all the rest of it, who was called Rem Fieldhouse. And eventually Rem graduated, they became partners and so on, and they had another student, Zaha Hadid. And between Rem and Elia, and Rem's wife Madeline, and Elia's wife Zoe Zengalis, they took what was a very talented lady and developed her ability to paint and to use colour and to be sensitive to colour. So that there's this long family relationship that you need to understand. Anyway, Zaha, by 1963, had been graduated for 3 or 4 years and won the competition for the Peak in Hong Kong, and was teaching in the school as well. And we did a folio box for Zaha. This is the second folio box. The first one was for Daniel Libeskind. Again, some of the drawings that were part of that folio one are in the exhibition. The idea with the folio boxes was primarily that, whereas with a publication, you get this nice book and it sits on the table somewhere and that's it. A folio is like a portfolio that you might have as a student or as an artist or whatever. It contains within it actual objects which in themselves are valuable and you might want to hang on your wall or to discuss as separate objects. So the folio boxes contained anything from 12 to 24 very beautifully printed individual sheets. Also had a catalogue which described the work that was being displayed. This is the cover of the folio box. The trick with the box itself as well, this is my sort of engine room. Part of the deal was that you don't see them now particularly, but at the time the 12-inch long-playing record was very much the thing that everybody collected. And they came in boxes which were 12 inches square. And I found a manufacturer who made these boxes, and they had all the dies, because the only thing that changed was not the overall size, but the thickness of the box. So that they had the dies which they could rapidly make out boxes of any thickness from very thin to very thick. And we had to provide the printed covers, and they provided the boxes. So it's a very easy and economical way of producing it. So we produced covers like this, which was screen printed in this case, and they made out the boxes, we did the rest of the art. So you would get a plate like this inside the box, and that would be a 12-inch square printed plate. Again, a very attractive thing if you want to representing the work of Zaha, and something you could actually frame if you wanted to put on the wall. And there were a series of those related to the Peak project that she'd run. Now, one of the things about that machine I was showing you a moment ago, the compographic machine, was although it was like there was no WYSIWYG, you couldn't see what you were doing. You could put in information and you could control the machine. So what you could do, you could tell the machine how long the line you wanted. So one of my colleagues, Lady Vicky Wilson, spent a considerably long night setting out this runaround on Zaha's drawing. Now, I mean, it's a doddle to do with Quark. I mean, I do it all the time, and it's click of a couple of buttons, and then, text gets where you want it to. But this was set line by line, with Vicky measuring the line, counting off the number of characters and words you would want to get on that line, so you didn't have gappy lines and tight lines, and was able to do this, which was a big advance from what we were able to do previously. Maybe I should take my scarf off or something. Anyway, that was that. And then this is just the same thing again, but this is part of Peter Wilson's folio in 1984. Because we were understanding the printing process, we were working with plate makers in particular, we knew how to achieve this sort of overlay effect. It's quite simple. You just have 2 bits of film and you expose the plate twice. I mean, there's nothing at all technically complicated about how it's done, once you know how. So we were able to do all this sort of things and so on. And one of the things, I don't know if any of you take a moment to study, there's one of Peter Wilson's drawings in the exhibition there. And Peter, like many artists, draws with a pencil. And he draws with a very fine, very sharp pencil. But he varies the weight of the line, not its thickness, varies the weight of the line by the amount of pressure he puts on as he's drawing the line. So the line can be very grey or can be very black, but it doesn't vary in its width. Now, technically, that is quite difficult to reproduce, because if you just use plain half tone, it doesn't work like that. Half tone, if you don't know what half tone is the way that newspapers, until you get the sort of digital inkjet printing that you get now, but the way that newspapers traditionally are printed, where you get a photograph and you break up the photograph into a series of black dots that vary in size depending on what shade of grey you're wanting to reproduce in the photograph. So you get something like this drawing of Peter Wilson's, where these lines here, the ropes on the bridge, are very fine lines, and there are other very fine lines throughout the drawing. So the challenge is, how do you reproduce that without making, where the line goes heavier, without making it wider because of the half-tone thing. So again, with the plate makers who really enjoyed all this. I mean, you think they throw up their hands and go out for a beer or something, but no, they really enjoyed it. And one of the plate makers I was working with very carefully redrew a lot of Peter's drawing so that the line was in grey, so that's on one colour plate, and then on top of that there was the half-tone plate, so that we varied the apparent weight of the line. This is enlarged enormously. I mean, there are, this, I don't know, from there to there it's probably less than an inch, or more than an inch rather. So this is very, very detailed. You've got to look at it with a microscope or a magnifying glass to see what we're doing. But in order to get that grading in Peter's drawing, we had to do these sort of tricks, and that applied to all sorts of things. After we'd had that one machine for 4 or 5 years, there was an upgrade, which was great. Now we could see what we were doing, right? So you could do some really amazing typography. This was from a portfolio, Gunter Dominic, that's right. And he had a poem that he wanted us to reproduce in the catalogue part of his folio box. And the poem was about trees, and the poem was both in English and in German. So the challenge was, how do you put this on a page without being incredibly boring about it? So this is what we did, was to set it out vaguely in the form of the tree, with the German and the English interlocked in order to provide the sort of graphic effect that we wanted. What you also should be aware of, at the beginning of this period and through most of the period, we didn't have access to computers because nobody did. The Apple computers arrived around about 1984, although they weren't particularly useful. The PostScript language, which was vital to graphic design, was only developed by Adobe starting around about 1984. So even towards the end of the period we were discussing, the sort of digital magic that one has access to now just didn't exist, just wasn't available. We had a computer which was made by Amstrad And the great thing about that was it had optical character recognition. So we were able to take a typescript and not retype it, just push it through this OCR extension and get a digital version of manuscripts that were coming to us. Yes, Quark Express, any of you who used Quark Express, started in 1987, and InDesign was like 15 years later, I think, something like that. Another series of books were these, which were the works, where he took the work of a particular architect, sometimes like Cedric Price, who were very close to the AA, other times somebody like Enno Goldfinger, who was a member of the council, and as an architect, an emigre architect from Germany in the 1930s, had been very influential on English architecture. And then later, Owen Williams, who was an engineer, again was very influential on English architecture as an engineer. So this was another series of publications that we produced, and that each was associated with an exhibition of the work of the artist. Exhibitions themselves, I showed you rather crude ones that we started off with, the Weimar Republic one. Now they're getting a bit more elaborate. This was Jan Kaplicki in Future Systems. Jan had a thing about, again, I can't remember the date of this, but it was late 1980s. And by now, computer-aided design was a possibility. I hope somebody knows who Jan Kaplicki is in Future Systems, but probably most of you don't. But anyway, don't worry about it, don't worry. This was a rather over-structured exhibition that Jan designed. There's another one which is more elegant, but I can't for the life of me remember what the exhibition was, so I'll skirt around that. There was then another series of publications called Types. Now this, those of you who are in the St. Fox School, or were in it last year, might remember, I forgot his name, I don't remember what's his name. Alex Wall, yes, Alex Wall. This was a study that Alex Wall had done as independent from the school. He was teaching one of the units in the school at the time. And it was about the Italian, interwar Italian holiday camps, I suppose is the nearest to the description, that were built in Italy in the mid-war period. Partly influenced by the Montessori teaching system, and partly as part of the theory of how you train the youth. And Alex had done a whole study about these buildings, illustrated by some wonderful photographs like this. Was what you do if you've got 500 young boys in your holiday camp, and drawings and illustrations of the buildings themselves. Again, accompanied by a very comprehensive, very interesting exhibition. Another of those was this Housing the Ayrshire, which was one of the council members at the time, but one of the British modernist architects, Christopher Dean, had done a particular study on housing, on buildings built to house the airships again in the mid-war period. So wonderful photographs like this sort of thing that we had. And for the exhibition of this, we borrowed, maybe 10 or a dozen airship models and hung them over the bar in the AA, which was beautiful, lovely sight. Another type of publication that we did was this called texts. And this, particularly the one on the right, the victims, was John Haydock. And then this was partly designed. Most of the design of these publications, what tended to happen was whoever was the author of the exhibition and the publication would have some idea of how they wanted it to look. And then Alvin would have some idea of how they wanted it to look, and then I had the job of making it look like they wanted it to look. So that was what I did. Now, in this case, there's a a lady designer, Lorraine Wild, who was American, who at that, excuse me, at that time, she was in New York. She's now in Los Angeles. But a very, very interesting, a very talented typographer and graphic designer. And Lorraine had done some work with John Haydeck, and John said, oh, I'd quite like Lorraine to be involved in the design of this publication. Now, I'll come back to the image of it, but Lorraine sent me this book, which was a Japanese, no text or anything in it, it's just a sort of notebook, Japanese notebook. But it had this curious binding. You can see it's sort of stitched through and then round the sides and so on. And at the top, and in detail, it's got little sort of folded paper corners on it. And the pages are what's called pocket pages. So the page doesn't have an outer edge, it only has two inner edges. So the piece of paper is folded and is bound along the open edge of the book. So you get like a pocket for each of the pages. Now there are two advantages to that form of binding. One is it totally reduces see-through. You know this thing, if you use light paper and you print on it, you can, if you're not careful, you can read both sides of the sheet through from one side. It eliminates that. It also means that you can use much lighter paper because you've eliminated the see-through problem. It also makes the book much softer, so that if you held this book by the spine, I mean, it might mouse map for a bird, if you hold it by the spine, it sort of does that. And one of the things, I mean, we had some silly discussions about publications, particularly just Alvin and myself. And one of the things we discussed was the flop factor of a publication. Right? Certain architects required a book which did this. Other architects required a book which did that. And there was a grading between, depending on the guy who it was. So that was one of the curious things that went on. Anyway, this had a high flop factor, which we thought was very appropriate for John Haydeck. So, in the course of, as I said, in the 1980s and 1970s, everybody was exploring things. And I'd done some work with a couple who were bookbinders. Mainly, I mean, they lived by binding theses for students and things like that. But they'd been at the Royal College of Art, they knew about bookbinding and all the rest of it. So I took this thing that Lorraine had sent to me along to them, and they said, oh, that's interesting. We did have a lecture once about how to do a Japanese binding. We'll have to think about that. I thought, yes, we'll do it. And by total coincidence, I was in the north of England, in a city called Chester, as it happened, and looked in the window of the bookshop, and then in the window of the bookshop was a book, a Japanese book binding. This was amazing. And it's got the whole thing about how you do, you get bits of paper and you sort of twist them and you get, this sort of oriental thing, you bang it with a bit of wood so it flattens it out, and you do this, that and the other. And it was all there, exactly how you did it. So this couple, they bound up 1,000 of these books. I mean, there's no way it can be mechanized. It's a hand binding technique. But anyway, it's beautiful. So, let's have a quick look. So when you open up the book, it's got John Haydeck sketches like this, and it's got his text. And out of this particular exercise, there was, amongst the drawings that he did in this victims book, briefly, it's I think Igor and Nicholas described the victims series of drawings of the gallery tour. Basically, it's a project about Berlin and the Nazi period when the Jews were being not treated too well, shall we say. And John, again, if you're not too familiar with John Haydeck's work, he's very interesting because, or was very interesting, because he tended to write scenarios about things, and every drawing had a story to it, or every story had a drawing to it, depending on how you want to look at it. And amongst the drawings in the victims thing was this drawing of John Haydak's. And this then, when John was in the school for a few weeks, teaching or helping with a unit run by Raoul and Charlie. And Raoul and John cooked up this idea that this would make a good student project to actually build this object that's John had described in the drawing. And I won't go into the narrative of it. It's called The Collapse of Time. So eventually, Raoul and his students built this machine, and you know, I do have a film of it, but it's rather boring, and I don't really like the soundtrack, so I'm not going to show it to you. But anyway, this was built in Bedford Square. We gradually occupied Bedford Square over the 1980s. There's a thing, you know, anywhere in the world, I'm sure it's just the same here as it is in London, you couldn't do anything in Bedford Square without the permission of the Bedford Estates. We couldn't hang things off the building, we couldn't use the pavement unless Bedford Estates and the local government agreed and all the rest of it. But they have a sort of inertia to them. So we found that if we wanted to hang banners up the front of the building, what you do is you get all the banners, you get them ready, you hang them. 2 weeks later, the Bedford Estates notices that you've hung them. 3 weeks later, they write to you. 4 weeks later, you reply to their letter. And 5 weeks later, you didn't want them there anyway, so you take them down again. So we gradually, I think the Bedford Estates and the Camden Council understood the humour of this situation, so they were much more generous in later times of letting us use the space in the square. Any of you have been to London, particularly in the summer, when the AA is on vacation and they have the summer exhibition there, you'll have seen installations on the pavement where this is. The AA still is the building, part of the building just behind the photograph there. Okay, another. No, it's 7:30. I'm getting swingy now, aren't I? I shall tell you one more story. This is a lovely publication. Sig Veterans, a Swedish architect, basically from the 1930s. Built some wonderful, or designed and have built some wonderful churches, a couple of which we studied for an exhibition about his work. Let me show you some. You must close your eyes for the next slide while I get to the one after it. Yeah, right. A couple of churches. That was one we just missed, and this is the other one. But that's not the point. His detailing was amazing. If you needed a light into your building, he'd leave a hole in the wall and he'd stick a piece of glass on the outside of it. No frame, a ceiling around the edge. I mean, it didn't sort of fall away. But so you've got beautiful details like this, glazing right up against the brickwork, or the interior of the church, something like this, with really, really tough, but very sensitively detailed. And Alvin and I, we talked about this publication and what it might be like. And this is the cover of the publication. It comes with a health warning now. I mean, it's not a book to put onto your shelf next to any other book, because what we decided was appropriate was to print the cover, the dust jacket as it were, onto an abrasive material. So it has the same texture as the textures and the quality of the brickwork that Leverett designed. Now, I want you to imagine central London, Bedford Square, elegance and all the rest of it, Alvin Boyarsky and I, out of the front door of the AA, hail a taxi, right? And this taxi takes us from the elegance of Bloomsbury to an industrial area of the city, to the northeast of Bedford Square. And we're there to visit a merchant who sells industrial abrasives. Because if you look on the other side of this printed cover, this is what you see. Waterproof silicon carbon, well, it's basically an industrial abrasive. So just imagine, there's these two guys from, you know, Bedford Square and Bloomsbury, arrive in a taxi at this merchant's warehouse, and go in, and we're obviously out of character with the rest of the people in the place. You know, we say, well, we want something sort of rough. We say, well, we sell abrasives, it's all rough. Can you show us that? So that, you know, you sort of say, oh, not quite rough enough. Oh, well, that's nice, but I don't like the colour. You know? So this, you know, these guys, I mean, they're mesmerised. So they're very polite. They sort of thought, you know, these guys need throwing out. And meanwhile, the taxi's outside and spot ticking. So in the end, and then you know, the last thing is, you say, well, that colour's right. It's rough enough. What does it smell like? So eventually we chose this material. It smells like tar. It was the right smell for the book, for the word of label. It was wonderful. Anyway, let's move on rapidly. Once I get going, I have to go on all night, wouldn't I? So this is another, oops, back one to Piccionis, the Greek architect, designed, he's a landscape designer rather than an architect, designed the path up to the Acropolis on the adjoining hill to the Acropolis. And for various reasons, this work came to our attention. And this is the cover of the book. One of the things, like with the previous Leatherus book, the covers are very important, how they're done and how they're produced and what they feel like and everything. So the cover of this Piccionis had to be a very particular colour. And in actual fact, we consulted Elia Zagelis and his wife, both of them agreed, about what would be the exactly right shade of colour. And this was the colour. You can't tell from this projection what it is, but it's a very rich, deep red colour. And in order to produce the cover of it, the colour was printed onto boards with the text, the captions reversed out in a tin. And then the pattern of the pathways is screen printed on top of it, so that it's actually the same colour, the ink of the pattern is the same colour as the background. And I could only photograph it by shining light across it, so you got a reflection. But in actual fact, you see it in a, you know, quite differently from the way it's represented there. And as it happened, I mentioned Raoul Kunsthaven a moment ago. Raoul introduced me to a girlfriend of his in the mid-70s, a lady called Helen Binet, who's a Swiss-Italian photographer, who for many years now has been his wife and partner. And Helen is a lovely lady and a tremendous photographer. And she photographed, like she'd photographed all the Leatherus things and so on, and quite a number of the things I've shown you tonight were photographed by Helen Binet. And so Helen was sent out to Greece to photograph this landscape and came back with a wonderful set of photographs like this. And one of the stories she tells, which I bumped into her a few weeks ago and I was teasing her about it, was, can you imagine, this is a public footpath. It's not a preserved thing, there isn't a sort of, you know, fence around it with a sort of police line, do not cross or anything like that. It's a public footpath. And when Helen and her assistant first saw it, it was full of cigarette ends and dog dirt and, you know, all the sort of crap that you get on a normal footpath. So you can picture the moment early one morning, because again, being that sort of photographer, she calculated exactly what time of day the photographs had to be taken in order to get the shadows right and the textures showing properly. So there's very early in the morning, there's Helen and her assistant with dustpans and brushes, you know, collecting up all the cigarette ends and all the rest of the rubbish, and then with an atomizer, spraying a fine water spray onto it so that she got the sort of reflection she wanted. Marvellous. Now, that made a lovely publication. And then this was the exhibition that we mounted in the AA. Her photographs went on the floor. I mean, the photographs of the floor, so why shouldn't it be on the floor? So the photographs went on the floor. The AA gallery, which is a close boarded beechwood floor, was covered with this sort of white limestone gravel in order to give the proper setting. And as it happened, one of the girls who worked at the AA, her boyfriend worked at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and lent us a couple of Greek sculptures for the exhibition. So from that early exhibition that I showed you first of all, where we got things out of a box, you know, and it was all very crude and all the rest of it, through to this, the way that work was presented in exhibitions and in publications changed. And for me, it was a wonderful period of time, wonderful set of experiences. And, well, hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to stop now. I could go on for another half hour, but there are lots more slides and lots more funny stories and so on. But I've been going on for over an hour, so if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Dennis, thanks, amazing. The students at the AA didn't have a studio like we have here that was a part of their social life. They did their work other places and came to the school to...
Yes, but we have a bar.
You had a bar.
We have a bar.
But my question is that it seems like the publications and the exhibitions had a way of sort of building that same culture that we perhaps share a little bit through the shared space of our studios.
Yes. I mean, the publications, I didn't particularly emphasize this in what I was talking about, but they varied from ones like the themes, where the students were very, very involved. And, you know, they would be promised pages in the publication and they would work on the publication, and sometimes one or two students would come and work with me and my team on the production of the publication. So yes, but again, it sounds as I'm being sort of light-headed about it, but the bar, not because there's alcohol and all the rest of it, although that never does any harm, but the bar is a great leveller. So you can be could be at the bar, and you know, you might be chatting to Alvin, or you might be chatting to some first-year student, or you know, everybody met there. And because of its location in central London, it was a place everybody passed through. So although it was London, one day you might find sort of Peter Eisenman propping up one end of the bar, or you know, Richard Meyer or somebody, or you know, European architect Hans Hollein might have just dropped in for a drink. So it's very much, but because of the nature of the school itself, there was a much closer integration between the teaching staff and the students and visiting critics and so on. Because that was the nature of the place. It wasn't always pleasant. I mean, I remember one guy running through with something like an axe trying to catch some other guy who was sleeping with his girlfriend. So you know, but I think I've got a film of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much again for a great stories. So I just have a quick question. So what kind of, qualities of these publications have been preserved over time, or how have they influenced later philosophies or publications?
That's difficult to answer because my involvement ended round about that time. The sad part of the story was that round about 88, 89, a couple of years before Alvin died, there had been a lot of opposition to the publications program from the trustees, the council of the AA, not from the students. The students, for the most part, supported it and so on, but the trustees of the AA saw it as Alvin indulging himself in an interest that he had in producing books. And there were various things happened that they virtually tried to stop him producing books. Before they were able to do that, well, they wouldn't have been able to do it, but Alvin died in 1990. And so they then took the opportunity. I mean, I was instructed to fire everybody in my studio so that we weren't able to produce books. I didn't fire everybody because they couldn't tell me to fire everybody. But, they tried to tell me to fire everybody. But there was there was little funding. We continued producing publications from what had been committed to during Alvin's period the next 4 or 5 years. One of the publications I was going to talk about, which was the last major folio that we did, was for a Japanese architect called Kiko Mizuna, which was an amazing publication, and one of the technologies that I didn't get around to talking about. But Kiko Mizuna did a very particular sort of Japanese art. Kojiki, I think is the name of it, if anybody knows what Japanese art is like. But anyway, these are very large paintings, wall paintings, about 3 meters high and 2 meters across. And we did a publication about his work. And for that publication, obviously if you took something of that size and reduced it onto the page of a book, it just didn't work. You had no idea of the scale of it. So what we did was we took, I think, 5 or 6 of these works and did reproduce it in the catalogue, the whole thing, but down to 8 inches square or something. But out of that, we took a section, or 2 sections in some cases, and reproduced those full size. And the thing about doing that, and some of the earlier publications, particularly with Peter Eisenman, and gosh, I didn't even get as far as the Moving Arrows books, Peter Eisenman's. But they were all printed in spot colour rather than in full colour printing, because that just ruins, flattens everything. And one of the plates in the Kiko Mizuna has got 28 spot colours on it. And there's no, at that time, because this is before we have Photoshop or anything like that. Now it'd be easy to do layers in Photoshop, run it off quite quickly, but we had to create each artwork for each of those 28 layers by hand, separately. And with the plate makers, we discovered, or they discovered or introduced us to a technique which is similar, if any of you are familiar with screen printing. In screen printing you make a mask which is then applied to a silk screen, and the parts that are being exposed wash away so the ink goes through, and parts that weren't exposed harden so that you get this mask. We used a technique based on that sort of chemistry. But you had, for that particular thing, we had a line drawing from Mizuna that was a bit like these children's books with painting by numbers, where you've got each little square with a number on it, and you tell this is bright red, and this is dark red, and that's green, and all the rest of it. It was like that. But we had the master drawing, and then we 28 times had to strip away the bits where the colour was. And we'd use that, we developed that technique, first of all on the Congo House project of Peter Eisenman's, it's in the gallery there. And we used it on a series of things after that. But that particular publication was already committed to before Alvin died. And it was 3 or 4 years after Alvin died that we got round to finally producing it. But since then, as I say, my time ended in 68, I think it was. No, it was a different school after that. So, although, we still produce lots of publications. I don't think anything might be as good as we do, but I would say that one. Okay? Anybody else?
Are there any specific publication about the pedagogical system
Well, I don't know. Eagle's the man to ask about that. He's just done an... That's Eagle's answer. He's behind me. I think this is the subject of your PhD. Yeah, so he's the man who can tell you all about it. That's what.
There were some essays and publications that came after he had passed away. It was actually a commemorative publication that was published in 1994, I believe, called The Architectural Association, the idea of the city, which brought many of the people that Dennis was talking about today who reflected on their time and behavior in his tenure and the pedagogical ideas that he instilled. So there's some very interesting reflections by Rem Koolhaas, Haji, Peter Eisenman, and that publication was published by MIT Press in the 1990s. That's the kind of book I started, and there's some essays to cover different aspects of his pedagogical ideas. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming.